Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Heather Denniston, and with me today is Dr. Benjamin Hardy. He is a psychologist, organizational psychologist, which I would love for you to explain a little bit more, which would be great, but also an author of two fantastic books. His most recent book is on personality, and it's talking about that personality isn't permanent, which I am so interested in talking about because, of course, with all of the personality tests out there and everything, that's the one thing that they say never changes. Your behavior can, but your personality always stays the same. So I'm very excited to have this really robust and meaty discussion with you, Ben. Thank you for joining today. I'm so grateful that you're here, and I look forward to our discussion. So
I'm really happy to be with you.
Oh, good. Well, thank you so much. Now, you are a father of five, your first three children you adopted, and I have been reading and listening to a little bit about that very tricky story, and congratulations on that all kind of finally working out in your favor. And then you found yourself pregnant with twins. And so you've got five at home under 12, right?
Yes. Yep. Five at home under 12. Yeah, we do. We have 12, 10, and 8. We got two 15-month-olds and potentially another on the way, to be honest with you.
Oh my gosh, that's fantastic.
Little much, but I think we're probably going to call it quits on that.
Yeah, right. Six and done. Very good. Well, can you tell me a little bit about what took you into psychology in the first place? And then you published your first book. You've done a couple of TED Talks. Now you've got this second book out. Can you just share a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, it's been a huge journey. I tend to think it really started when I was 11, when my parents got divorced. I think that was kind of the big one. And divorce is pretty traumatic for anyone, but yeah, my father became a drug addict, was a very intense situation. And ultimately so there's two types of trauma, and obviously we'll get into trauma and how trauma really shapes people's personalities, but there's capital T trauma, which ultimately is like some event that leads you to identifying a certain way, so it's like, trauma shapes your worldview, it shapes your identity. And so, but there's lower T trauma as well, which is essentially just being in a chaotic environment where, you just have no stability. And so you're kind of always in a fight or flight state. Yeah. And that was very much my life, junior high and high school, and just not really being sure of my identity, not really being sure of my footing. And yeah, just not really in the best of state. After I got out of high school, I was playing, online video games pretty much all day and just not really happy, and just kind of viewing the situation and viewing the trajectories of those around me and just not really being stoked about the situation. Yeah. What I ended up ultimately doing was leaving and doing actually a church mission, which was really big for me. And that really got me into a new environment, into a new role, and just kind of got me journaling, reading books, involving myself in, social service and things like that. And just it really helped me. It really helped me to re-identify, like really transform myself in so many different ways. And I filled stacks of journals and just really just loved it. And it was kind of during that experience ultimately that I thought, I want to study psychology. And so it wasn't actually the trauma of my youth. It was actually the watching of myself transform and just going through so many things. I'm like, I want to understand this more, because I went through an extreme transformation, but I was also I ended up going home and just realizing like no one saw me for my transformation. They all saw me from their lens of my former self. Like they couldn't break their former perspectives. And so I knew if I stuck around that environment, I would bail. And so that was actually a lot of the inspiration for Willpower Doesn't Work, which is all about how your environment shapes you. And so, yeah, and then I've just been studying psychology ever since, and reading tons of books, and just really continuing to learn and continuing to apply it to the extent I can, and striving to be a more flexible human being and a more flexible learner.
Right. Now, you are a widely acclaimed author on Medium. You've had some of the most read blog posts and have kind of been their number one writer for a long time as far as that goes. In fact, I went over there the other day and I'm like, how great is he? And it's like the first post I came up with was like 18,000 people loved this one particular post. And I was reading through and I just couldn't get enough. I love what you put up there. And so I'm looking forward to talking about this new book, Personality Isn't Permanent, because In the industry I am in, wellness, corporate wellness, working with leadership and trying to up level by connecting wellness to their success, we end up talking about personality style, whether it's Myers-Briggs or Enneagram or DISC or whatever it is. And this new book of yours kind of goes, not so much. So can you talk to me a little bit about your inspiration for the book, and then kind of the process you went through in writing it, and what was the motivation behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, if we had personality right, there probably wouldn't be 5,000 tests, right? And so I think that's a good example of a clear problem. But the reason I wrote it was not because those tests are non-scientific, although I learned that abundantly through my PhD program. So in organizational psychology, a big aspect of that's what's called psychometrics, which is essentially test development and test validation. And it was just like over and over, like all of my professors would just constantly talk about the non-validity and just non-high quality, of these tests, which are type-based, putting people into essentially broad categories, ignoring context, all of those things where people essentially over-adopt a label, which then becomes their identity, a fixed mindset, and they ignore context and many other things. But that was not the inspiration to writing the book. That ended up just being like a really interesting thing that I dove deep into the book, is the problem with labels and fixed mindsets and things like that. But what led me to writing the book was in 2018, I read the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. I'm not sure if you've heard of that one.
I literally just read it.
Oh yeah. Interesting. Yeah. It's a great book, right?
It's fantastic.
Yeah. So two of the things he said in that book to me really struck. And it was, again, probably over 2 years ago when I listened to it. I've listened to it I had to actually listen to the book multiple times to understand it, to and obviously trauma is only one core component of personality. But one of the things that Bessel talked about, obviously, is that trauma leads to a frozen personality, and you're obviously trapped in the initial reaction of the experience. And then your whole identity and your view of the world is framed through the perspective of the trauma. And, personality is not something that's supposed to stop developing. It's supposed to be a continuous development, but a big aspect of that development is your own emotional flexibility. Like if you're not, basically what trauma does is it leads you to being very psychologically and emotionally rigid, both in how you view yourself and how you view the world and what you're willing to do. Trauma leads to what's called a cognitive commitment or a fixed mindset. Like so one of the other things that he said is that it shatters imagination and confidence, which makes total sense. And if you're not imaginative or confident or flexible, then you're going to stop learning. Mm-hmm. And so those were some of the things that really intrigued me, because one of the core tenets of psychology is that the best way to predict someone's future behavior is by looking at the past. Mm-hmm. And I always wondered why that was true. And the common belief as to why it's true is that people's personality is just who they are. And so people have an innate personality, and that's why they're consistent. But there's just so much better research these days as to explaining that personality is not permanent, and that's not the reason they're consistent. There's other factors leading them to consistent behaviors.
So that is super interesting. I hadn't thought about that, and I love the whole, whenever I've kind of looked at these personality tests, I'm like, the trauma thing comes up for me. Like everybody has such individual experience, and that I completely resonate with the micro and macro type, capital T, little t trauma situations. And I think this whole thing is pretty fascinating. So tell me a little bit about like pervasive, destructive societal myths about personality, and kind of how are you suggesting we look at it differently?
Yes. So the common perspectives are that personality is generally innate, that it's who you are from when you're born to generally who you are when you're going to be when you die, and that it's for the most part inflexible. That it's, you're generally, if you're very much an introvert, you're probably not going to become an extrovert. And because it's innate, because it's non-flexible, the goal then is your job then is to discover your personality. This is one of the reasons why personality tests are so popular, is because they claim to then give it to you in a fast food fashion. And so the goal is to discover your core self, which is non-flexible, non-changeable. And once you then discover yourself, then you can set goals and build a life around your personality to cater to your core true self. That is generally a common view of personality. It's something to be discovered. And if you don't discover it, then you're going to be doing things that are outside of your true self, your authentic core self, And as a result, you're never going to be happy. You're never going to be successful. And so, yeah, the common perspective is find your personality so you can build your life around it.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
Alternatively.
Yeah, alternatively, and I'll explain some very beautiful science. So there's some really good stuff from Dr. Daniel Gilbert, and there's plenty of other researchers. I'll give you Hal Hershfield as well. He's at UCLA, but Gilbert's at Harvard. He's got a great TED Talk, by the way, which you'd love. It's a shorty too. It's called The Psychology of Your Future Self.
Ooh, okay.
But Gilbert's been studying personality development over time, as far as past development and also future development for a long time. And I'll actually start by explaining his research by asking you a question.
Oh, ew.
Do you think you're the exact same person you were 10 years ago?
No.
Okay. That's like a very common answer. So if you're not the exact same person you were 10 years ago, to me, that should say a lot, right? Like,
yes.
A lot of people, when I ask that question, they're like, no way, not at all. It's like, all right, well, what 5 years ago? Like, and so like, it's pretty, so Gilbert asks people this question, are you the same person? And really personality in a lot of ways, you can think of it as preferences. It's the things you prefer. It's the things that you're interested in. It's the things you tolerate. There's probably you probably have different interests, different goals, different perspectives than you had 10 years ago. You probably also don't tolerate things that you used to tolerate. Maybe you won't spend your time on things that you used to spend your time on. Like you just, and so your future self is the same way. So basically what the research says is it's very good to view your former self as a different person. And I think that that's something we can do. You're not the same person. You have a very different perspective than your former self. I think what Stephen Covey said is really good. He said, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. And so your former self saw the world differently and they acted in the world differently. Your future self is the same way. Your future self, it's really good for decision-making to view your future self as a different person than you are today. Your future self is going to have a different context. They're going to have different perspectives, hopefully better priorities and better perspectives if you've gone through some learning from between now and then. And so it's just really important to realize these are three different things. And then if you know that your future self is going to be different than your current self, then you wouldn't overly own your current self. Like it's not like you don't take seriously who you are, but you don't have to say that who you are right now is the be all end all, which happens too much. And so what Gilbert says is that human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished.
Oh.
Right? And then he also says the reason, and this connects back to Bessel, the reason that people think that they're finished is because it's a lot easier to remember the past than to imagine the future. And people don't spend an enormous amount of time imagining the future. Usually what's called our identity narrative is based on our past. We don't explain ourselves based on the person we're striving to become. We explain ourselves based on who we think we currently are, or who we've been. But what the research is really going towards these days is that in order to live intentionally, in order to engage in what psychologists call deliberate practice, and even to make quality decisions here and now, you actually have to have some scope of who your future self is. If you don't know who a future self is, then how could you know who you are today? You wouldn't know how to act or who to be because you have nothing to aspire towards or nothing to frame against. And so in order to make decisions here and now that are useful, that would lead in a certain direction, and even to engage in like high quality learning, you have to have a clear future self in mind in order to go through the learning that helps you get there. And so these are just like some very useful perspectives.
That's huge for decision making. Like if we don't have that, visualization, then you can go left and right, and then back over right, and then left.
You have no clue who you actually are now if you don't have a clear sense of a future self.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And so I'd like to go back to trauma just for a minute because I've been reading some Sarno and some different.
Oh, goodness. I referenced Sarno in the section on the subconscious.
Okay, very cool. Well, I'd like to know a little bit more because that's something that's always kind of been a sticking point for me is, like I kind of mentioned earlier, is these personality profiles are a little bit box-like and don't take into consideration any trials, trauma, anything like that you've been through that would shape you quite differently. And so is there more on that we can share kind of for people who are starting to go, oh, okay, I need to be looking at my future self, but how do I reconcile with some of the small t, big T stuff that I'm dealing with now? I was abused if you were abused as a child, or
yes,
you had, how do I create, how do I visualize this future person when I'm having this to contend with?
It's big. It's big. Just like you need to conceptualize your future self, you have to actually reconceptualize your former self. It's very important to understand that your past is a narrative. It's a story. It's a perspective. So just like Covey said, we don't see the world as it is, but as we are. That same principle is towards your past as well. You don't actually see the past as it is. You see the past as you are. 10 years ago, you actually saw the past differently. As you grow, as you mature, you see things differently. The problem with trauma is that an event occurred, could have been 5 years ago, it could have been 20 years ago. And if you haven't reframed it and reconceptualized it and essentially re-remembered it, changed the memory of it by expanding it or just changing your view of it, then you're still viewing that specific that specific event from the initial reaction or the initial experience when it had. And so there's an aspect of your whole life in your filter that's literally still trapped in like the 10, 12, 15 version-year-old of yourself. Yeah. And so it's important to realize, first, again, you're not the same person you were before, but you need to essentially recontextualize your past. And so I can explain like why and how that works, or do you want me to just give like strategies? I think it's kind of good for people to understand how the process works, but I'd be happy to just explain strategies as well. Whatever is easiest for your audience.
I got all day. I'm sure they do too. I think awesome stuff.
Well, it's brilliant to realize that the past is flexible. The past is very much, as one of my professors said, the past has possibility. And also, it's best if the past is information, not emotion, except for the emotion that you've chosen to give to it. And so your former self, as an example, has an identity, but you can also re-relate to that former self. And I can provide examples of how that works. But let me just explain to you the idea of context versus content. And then we can talk about how to reframe the context. Because obviously I'm not talking about changing the content of your past. I'm talking about changing the context. But when you do change the context, it actually changes everything about it. So let me give an example. I'll give two examples, actually, two really quick and easy ones. One is this one will be a shorter example, but we are having this conversation in the midst of the coronavirus. In a couple weeks ago, I sent an email, actually even like last week or 2 weeks ago, I sent an email to my email list. And in that email, I used the word viral. I was talking about an article, actually. So this article is going viral. It didn't trigger a lot of people, but I had like 20 emails come back and say, you really shouldn't use that word right now. And I said, okay, that's fine. I won't. But no one would have said that 3 or 4 weeks ago, right? And so the word viral is content, but context shapes its meaning, right? Like in this situation, that word means something different to a lot of people. And so the context determines the meaning of anything. I'll give one other just quick example, and then we'll talk about how you can reconceptualize meanings, because that's really what we're talking about here. So my mother-in-law was recently working out at Curves. And this probably happened a week ago, probably like a month ago, honestly, but I love the story. Curves, I guess, is a female fitness place, right? So she was working out and just doing her thing, and there was a very obese woman in the gym exercising, and the reason it was noteworthy is because she was wearing like very tightly fitted gym clothes, just kind of like walking around quite confidently, and like my mother-in-law was just kind of observing the situation and just noticing that, like, obviously people were kind of looking at this woman judgmentally because she was so big, but my mother-in-law happened to be working out next to her, and while they were chatting, because she's pretty chatty, my mother-in-law, but she found out that this woman, she's great, actually, love her. But she found out that over the last several months, this woman's actually lost 150 pounds.
Wow.
Right? So does that change anything about how you view this woman?
Yeah, well, and that's like I was kind of hoping that's the direction it was going, because I'm like that she feels so differently in her body, and another woman who's that weight may not kind of operate in the same way. And it's context. It's like, your mother-in-law had different information than some of the other women there might have had.
Immediately, like and different information than her former self had. Like five minutes before, she was looking at this woman a certain way. After she finds out, holy cow, this woman in the last 6 months has lost 150 pounds. Like she went from maybe being a little critical to being incredibly inspired instantly. Yeah. And so again, it's not the thing you're looking at, it's how you're looking at it. Like Wayne Dyer actually said, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change, which I think is a really interesting quote. So when it comes to the past, it's important to realize that your current view of it is just a view, just like we would have one view or another of this woman or the word viral. And that your current view may not be the most effective view. In order to change the view, you have to actually get information, just like my mother-in-law had to get information about this woman to have a better perspective. And so getting information really can neutralize the emotion. Like, you know, and that's really what you want your past to be, is information that you can use, so that your past is something that you can use to make better decisions in the future, rather than something that, you know, you're a victim to. Like the past would be really nice if you could frame it as, this happened for me, not to me. If everything that happened in your past is happening for you because you can use it, rather than that it happened to you and therefore you can't do something.
Yeah.
And so
one's powerful, one's powerless. So
yeah. And so as far as basic strategies, and it's really not rocket science. I will say one more quote, and this comes from Peter Levine. And if you liked The Body Keeps the Score, you'll really like Peter Levine's work. He wrote a book called Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma. But basically, one of the things he said in the book is that trauma isn't what happens to you. It's what you hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness.
Can you say that one more time, please?
Yeah, it matters. Yeah, I will. I've had to say it. I mean, so trauma isn't what happens to you. It's what you hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. So I'll give an example. So you need an empathetic witness. So as an example, there's an epidemic, and this is something that there's a lot of good research on, but math trauma. Math trauma is essentially the idea that you can't do math. You know, and so a lot of people in America, a lot of kids in high school and junior high just genuinely don't believe that they could learn math. They don't believe they are good at math. And that belief came from, at some point or another, they had an experience. It was someone might have told them they were bad at math. Maybe they failed a test. They hit some experience and they had no empathetic witness there. They had no one there to coach them or guide them or help them to say, you know what, it's okay that you failed this test. Let's keep going. Like, they didn't have that. And with trauma, you isolate yourself, you internalize it, and then a narrative occurs, which is called a cognitive commitment. But essentially, it formulates your identity, and that identity then shapes how you see the world. So it's like, oh, I must not be good at math. That's called a fixed mindset. But that then shapes your goals and your future. And it shapes what's possible to you. Again, it shatters imagination and flexibility. You're no longer flexible or imaginative towards math. Therefore, you have no capability towards learning it nor desire to. And so that's really what happens to us when an event occurs that shapes our identity and our narrative. And so now, again, you need like an empathetic witness. And I think that there's really two ways to do that. And unless, like, obviously there's more spiritual ways such as prayer and things like that, but like, journaling is one really powerful way to reconceptualize the past. I think, so in psychology, we call it exposure therapy, but the more you expose yourself to something, the more the novelty wears off. Yeah. And so just by writing about, and this I think is an easy step, the empathetic witness part, may be talking about it. Could be therapy, could be many other things, could be friends, could be mentors. For me, actually, talking about it with like people that I was like doing the missionary work with, and like even like leaders, like really helped me to like let go of a lot of the trauma from my past, which was huge. Yeah. But I think really starting to journal about it and asking yourself perspectives that allow you to see it from a different perspective. Like, I think that there's great questions, for example, like, how would my future self view this situation? And I'm talking about, it could have been anything. It could have been like your parents got divorced when you were age 11. It could have been, it could have been something worse. Or it could have been that like I was talking to someone recently and they talked about why they developed the belief that they weren't good at reading or good at writing, because of something that someone said to them. And so it's like, how would your future self view this situation, or how could you see it differently? Or how do you see the situation differently than you did back then? Or, what other information do you need to get in order to view this situation differently? It's just really getting more information and then ultimately choosing the lens through which you view it. And I think being willing to talk about it is key. I think with people with trauma, they don't want to talk about it. But if you talk about how it's impacted you, about why you're going to do things differently as a result, and then you get to actually shape the narrative of your past, you get to say, yeah, this was something that's tough, but like, therefore now I'm going to do this. Like, you get to actually ultimately choose how you remember something and how you frame it. And you can choose to look at it from a positive lens, so that then you can have a better future. I mean, it's essential.
Yeah, that is fantastic. I'm going to go back through this and take notes like a viewer, because you have said so many amazing things. So tell me a little bit about the new book, the personality book. What are, like, when you finished it, when you completed it, what did you think, okay, I'm giving this out into the world. What do I hope for from this?
Yes. I hope that, and if we have a second, I would love to break down personality tests, just because I think you would think it's interesting.
No, I absolutely don't.
I think you'll think it's radically interesting as far as like what it actually does to people's identity. But what I really hope people get out of this, and I think when you go through it, you'll be surprised. I think you'll be shocked at what's actually in here. But I really want people to understand why they are the way they are, and that it's not because it's just who they are. There are crucial things that have led them to being the way they are and viewing the world the way they do. And these things are flexible. These things can change. The core ones that I talk about are obviously trauma, which can be reframed, your identity story, which is basically how you view yourself, your past and your future, which totally can change.
Yeah.
And I make the argument that, given that the whole future self is such a crucial element of even your current identity, taking the time it's impossible to live intentionally without having a clear future self in mind.
Yes.
That if that becomes your story, like literally, if you start telling everyone that this is who I'm going to be, or this is what I'm striving for, and this is what I'm it takes a little courage, probably a lot of courage in many cases, to actually own that.
Yeah.
But it creates a lot more of an authentic environment around you. It also allows people to see what you're up to so that they can actually observe the change happening, rather than in their own tunnel vision way, continuing to believe you're the same person you were 5 years ago, because human beings can be lazy in how they see the world. So identity narrative is really big. And if you're really proactive about that identity narrative, it can then lead you to acting and being more consistent with your future rather than being consistent with who you've been in the past. Yeah. Subconscious is a big one. And obviously I go into the Sarno work and I go into many things, but your subconscious is a big aspect of your personality. And there are completely powerful, useful strategies for reframing personality. I mean, subconscious is very much emotional. It's very deep. And it's very connected to these things that we've been talking about. And there's ways to up-level it so that basically what's autopilot for you, because subconscious is you on autopilot. It's your habit. It's you without thinking. That's why it's unconscious. And you can up-level your subconscious so that, your new normal is essentially you on autopilot. Your future self becomes you on autopilot. But then you would obviously want to reconceptualize. And then the last one's obviously your environment, peer groups, context. We can obviously see that epidemics and things like that can change global personality, and obviously individual personality. And so your environment, your context, your roles, role is one of the biggest things that predicts personality. And just talking about strategies, obviously within all of these sections, how to reframe trauma, how to reshape your story, how to update your subconscious, and then ultimately how to be very strategic about your environment. So that you can essentially weed out things that would keep you your former self, so that you can create an environment that would trigger who you're planning to be. And there's, other very useful strategies to apply. So that's kind of the depth of the book.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And it was just released a couple days ago, so I have not had the chance to read it, but I have done a lot of research on some of the things that you've been up to and doing. So I do look greatly forward to
You're gonna love it.
And so let's dive into some of the personality test sort of comments you have around that, and a debunking, so to speak.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I'll be brief with it, but I think that they're very useful perspectives for people. Particularly, and again, I'm not saying you don't have to love these tests. A lot of people do. It's a $2 billion industry, but I'm just going to explain a few perspectives just so that you can kind of maybe have a different perspective. So in order for a test to actually be considered scientific, it has to be what's called consistent, and it has to be reliable. Or valid and reliable. But valid means that it's actually studying what it says it does. And if you want to have some really good reading on this, do you know who Adam Grant is?
Mm-mm.
Adam Grant, he wrote the book Give and Take. He wrote Originals, and he recently wrote Plan B. But he's a really famous, honestly, psychologist. He's at the Wharton School at Penn. He's written a lot of great stuff on Myers and Briggs, just honestly, and about why it's he explains very interestingly, talking about the questions and how they're just not valid, not useful, and just really from a psychological perspective, it is junk science.
That's awesome.
But one of the reasons, so the questions are really not formulated in a coherent way. But the other problem is that it's just not reliable. And reliability means that when you take the test, you get consistent results. Test, retest, reliability. These things don't have that. So what the research shows is there's some really good longitudinal research now that shows over a 70-year period of time, people took personality measures, and then 70 years later, they took the test, and their personality, the longer, and it doesn't have to be 70 years, but their personalities are so non-correlated. And there's now other research that just studies, this is another good example, but one recent study took two populations, and basically with the one group, gave them the same personality test 2 different times, maybe a week or 2 apart, with the same test administrator. And in that situation, they actually got pretty similar scores, similar conditions, and it was only like 2 weeks. You're probably not going to make that big of adjustments in your self-image at that point. But the other group basically had the same situation. They took the same personality test 2 times, same time frame, but the only difference was that there was a different test administrator. And just by making that one adjustment, the 2 scores were actually non-correlated for that group.
Oh my gosh.
And so it's just another example that these tests are radically influenced by context, situation, by your mood, by what you're doing the test for. Can I
just butt in for just a second?
Do it.
So if I had to pick one that I actually like, have in the past liked DISC and
a lot of business people do.
Yeah, it's so true. And just a couple weeks ago, I was working on it with a group, and the gal had taken it the night before, and she woke up the next morning. She said, I was in such a bad mood last night. I'm going to take it again. Her scores were different. And it's like, well, your personality's not changing overnight. So that was kind of
maybe it did.
Or maybe it did. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and it's just like, well, if it's fixed, then it wouldn't change 12 hours later. So I just thought that was an interesting data point. Keep going.
No. Well, so that's kind of more the scientific significance of what's going on here. As far as what it does so I'll tell you why people like them, and then I'll tell you why they really shouldn't like them. The reason people do like them is because if you haven't spent a lot of time digging into your past and being very intentional about how you view and frame your past, and if you haven't spent a lot of time clarifying and defining your future identity, and then really being clear on the identity story. And so basically, if you haven't been intentional about who you are, which I would say, again, given statistical facts that most people are living subconsciously, which is 95% autopilot as a reflection of their environment, that type of intentionality is probably not something that everyone does. Right. And so if you don't have a clear sense of identity, what these tests do is they give you that. They give you a quick identity, which allows you to have a frame of explaining yourself. Oh, I'm an ENFJ. I'm a D. Like it allows you to have a story and a sense of identity, which then gives you a box, which is actually really psychologically helpful, because ambiguity, like not knowing who you are, is almost like kind of like being in a stress state. You're like, you can't explain yourself. And so these things are a fast food way to explain yourself. They give you a sense of identity, which can be very relieving. And so that's why people like them. So there's a lot of research, and you would love this person's research. I don't know if you've ever heard of Ellen Langer before. Ellen Langer.
I've heard the name, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure what her.
Absolutely brilliant. So she's got 2 books. She's been a Harvard psychologist for decades. But so she's done so many research studies, but her 2 books, which are so mind blowing. One of them is Mindfulness. So she's considered the queen of mindfulness. Mindfulness is a very trendy topic over the last 10 years. She's been studying it for about 40. And so she's considered the queen of mindfulness research. She wrote a book called Mindfulness and a book called Counterclockwise. But one of the big things that she studied is the effect of labels on mindfulness. And essentially what she's found is that if someone overly assumes a label, they become radically mindless to all of the times when the label is actually not true. So if someone identifies as depressed, they will believe that they're always depressed, even though like in a given day, there's many, many times when they're not. They're feeling great. But in psychology, so labels create tunnel vision. You see the world through the lens of the label. Yes. And so in psychology, we call that selective attention. So I'll give a really easy example. Like if you buy a car, you can start to see that car everywhere, right? Right?
Yes.
Have you noticed that?
Yes.
And so like because it's relevant to you, you attend to it. You notice it, even though like before you didn't notice it. And in fact, you still don't notice all of the other thousands of cars around you. Yeah. And so that's really what a label is that you've identified with this one label, and it's like seeing your car. It's the one car you notice, but you don't notice all the other millions of cars. Yeah. And so the label creates tunnel vision, but the big problem is, aside from the fact that it creates tunnel vision, is that people really own the label. And that because they've owned this identity, they then set goals and pursue things in life to confirm the label. And that's really what people do is they think that they've now discovered themselves. Therefore they can set, goals or get in relationships around that personality. That it's like, they think that that's who they really are. And I think that I really love the quote from Gilbert, where he says, human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. Yeah. And it's really just interesting. Like, it's really interesting when you realize that context matters so much, not content. These tests are so obsessed with content. I'm a D. Yes. But again, context matters more than content. Yes. And so like it in psychology, there's a concept called the fundamental attribution error. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
I haven't.
But basically it's the idea that you overly characterize someone based on what you think what their character is versus their context. So like if someone cuts you off on the road, you might say like they're a bad person, but you might not realize you would be committing the fundamental attribution error if you did that, because you wouldn't realize that maybe there's something else at play. Maybe there's something else happening. You ignore that there's probably situational factors leading to why this person is acting the way they do. And so, these tests ignore context, but yeah, I mean, they lead to a fixed mindset ultimately. And it's just strange. It's strange when you hear it. Yeah.
Well, and I think if you really go down that rabbit hole, it's dangerous. I mean, it squishes potential. It does. I mean, there's so many things that
it's very dangerous. I actually almost didn't get married because of a personality test.
Really?
Yes. So a famous personality test, maybe you've heard of it. Have you ever heard of the color code?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, very popular personality test when I was in college. And my in-laws loved that test. And as it so happened, and I would not get the same score now, but 8-9 years ago, I took the test and I came out as a white. So like there's like four styles, right? There's like, and again, I think it's so strange that we can categorize people into 4 different ways, and that all of these tests categorize people in different ways. But with the color code, you've got reds, which are like really like your type A, like goes. You've got blues that are like really relational. You've got whites that are kind of just like passive, thoughtful people. And then you've got yellows, which are essentially extroverts. Those are the only 4 types of people that exist on the planet, according to the color code. But anyways, I came out as a white, and Lauren's family kind of identify themselves as all reds, although not exactly, but they're like kind of like we're a type A kind of people. Yeah. And my wife is a red, although I actually don't think that she would totally get that now if she took the test. But anyways, my wife had actually formerly been married. She was married, and she was in a very abusive marriage, and she was married to a red. And she came out of that, and it was very traumatizing to her. She ended up traveling the world and doing many things and like really rebuilding herself. But I was the first person a few years later that she like seriously dated, first person. And when they found out that I was a white, they were like, oh no. They're like, she was so manipulated and so controlled in her former marriage that she is never going to let that happen again. And so she's going with this passive white so that she can control him and not be ever controlled again. So so they were like, they literally said like, you probably shouldn't marry this white because you need a real man. Like you need someone who can, and what's funny about that is that when you've assumed an identity on someone, you literally ignore context. You just are viewing the person and what they didn't notice or what they weren't even observing was everything I had done from my past to get to where I was. That I was like a straight A student in an amazing college, and I had freaking huge goals, and I was on fire towards those goals, but none of that mattered because I was a white. And so like, they didn't see any of where I had come from. They didn't see any of where I was going. They didn't even see how I was showing up in my life. They were just like, oh, this guy's a white. Like, you can't marry this guy. And like, we almost didn't get married, honestly, literally because of a stupid personality test.
Okay. This is awesome. And I'm curious, how many times have you told this story on podcasts or videocasts? Say never.
Never.
See, I'm the only one.
I will say it's the introduction of the book. It is literally the introduction of the book. And so I've written the story, but the story will change. The story, I've probably told that story on like 5 podcasts.
Yeah. No, I'm giving you a bad time. Can you hold that book up again? I love the cover.
Yeah, I mean, this covers a little bit. So it's kind of like you can see like the personality in pencil. And then
I love it.
Yeah, this is kind of one the publisher sent me as a pre, and so it's like kind of folded. It's not very great.
Yeah.
But I love the cover too. I mean, I love that it's in pencil. I love that there's eraser marks on the personality.
I love that. Yeah, that's really, really cool. Well, I want to say a huge congratulations. I want to ask you just 2 things before we start to wind it down. One is, what do you and Lauren do? You are busy. You're an accomplished author. You have 5 kids. A big thing that I talk about is, wellness in the crazy times, not just when things are calm and all of that. So what do you What do you 2 do to stay healthy in your household?
I love it. Such a beautiful question, and really have enjoyed entirely this conversation. We do a lot of things. I mean, we live actually quite simple lives. We're very big on like a shared purpose, and we very much support each other in the various roles we're in. And so like Lauren, I love waking up and just getting to work. And so I'll wake up at like 5. And so she's very much like, she'll just cover the morning. Like she understands that like, okay, if that's what's best for Ben in the situation, like I'll rock the morning. So she rocks the mornings. I pick up the kids from school and just am totally not working like after 2 or 3 o'clock.
Great.
And you know, we ever since we had our kids, one of the things that initially surprised us, because we hadn't like really studied parenting that much, was like we found out the kids need like 12 hours of sleep, like 11, 12 hours of sleep. That was really new to us. We were like, that seems like a lot, but that's, and so like our kid, we've always had like night routines, like where we'll do dinner together as a family. You know, like we'll have like a family like time, we'll read books together and just do like family stuff to zone down. And like our kids always went to bed at like 7. Now they're a little older, so now they all go to bed at 8, but they all go to bed at the same time and they get like 10, they're still 12 hours, or not, they don't wake up at 8, but they wake up at about 7. So they get 11 hours of sleep, which is huge for kids. And, you know, we get good sleep. We go to bed at like 9 or 9:30. And we really have simple lives. I mean, we focus on our family when we can. We travel together. And we just try to create moments together. I mean, it's our lives are not that complex.
Yeah.
But, you know,
well, good.
Even now, we've actually been, just as an example, we've been sugar-free, like refined sugar-free as a family for this year. We've done a year before in the past, and it really helps our kids and helps us. And so like we eat good food and we do simple things.
That's a huge one. The sugar-free piece. I mean,
it's big.
I'm working with somebody who's dealing with some cancer right now, and you know, I have this list of things that she can choose to do, and she said, if there's only one on that list that you could do, what would you pick? I'm like, sugar-free. So it's so impactful to the health and to so many things in your body.
It's big for stuff like cancer too. I mean, it makes a big impact.
It makes a huge impact. So yeah, that is awesome. So Ben, what are the different ways that people work with you, and how do we get a hold of you, and where are we going to see you next?
That's awesome. I usually don't work with people. If, you know, sometimes I will give, you know, a speech if it's the right situation. Sure. The best way, obviously, to get to know me is reading the book, Personalized and Permanent. I think that book will shock and stun and really excite and inspire people. Obviously, I have blog posts. You can read them on benjaminhardy.com. I've written at many other places. Great. I don't do any like private coaching. I do have an online course, which I sometimes sell. If people buy this book, there are lots of free giveaways. You know, like awesome. There's like a personalities and permanent course. I've actually had a course I've written all on journaling. That's actually like, I think over 10,000 people have bought my journaling course before.
Oh, that's cool.
And like, that's a great course. And like, I give that away. I have a personalized and permanent course. I actually have a blogging course that I again, it's like not for sale, but I've sold it many times for over $1,000, and like that's another free bonus for people who buy the course. So I'm really just wanting people to buy the book. Honestly, I'm not trying to send anyone anywhere else. Right. But if they do buy the book and if they want additional information, there's lots of freebies that they can get. That's good to know.
So don't miss that in the back of the book, guys. And yeah, this book has a lot of power. I'm super excited to see what it does as far as inspiring people and making them just anything that makes you walk away and think differently and start to kind of, you know, it changes your course a little bit, which I think this is going to do. That's a huge gift to the world. So thank you so much for what you do. And writing is not an easy job. It takes a lot of discipline and it's really, really hard work. And so thank you for making that your life work. It's really fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, it's another myth of personality that once you find what you want to do, it's going to be easy and natural. That's junk. Writing books is the thing that I choose and love to do, and it's the absolute hardest thing that I do. Yes. Parenting is not easy and natural for me. Like anything that requires transformational learning, that doesn't mean you can't love it and that you can't be in a flow state while you do it, but it's the idea that you're going to find something that's easy and natural and that's your personality is such a crazy idea, but it is hard and I love doing it, and I can't wait to do more. So thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Do you have another book in mind in your head?
I do. Yeah, actually, I'm honestly coming out with 2 books this year.
Oh, you are? Can you say what the second one is?
Yeah, so this book's with Penguin Random House, which is one of the big 5. The other book's actually with Hay House, which is kind of more of a spiritual publisher, but they actually have a business imprint. And I'm co-authoring a book with a guy named Dan Sullivan. I don't know if you know who he is.
I've also heard that name.
Yeah. Dan Sullivan owns a company called Strategic Coach. And it's
Okay.
like an entrepreneurial coaching company, but he and I have a book that's coming out. This is more of an entrepreneurial book. It's called Who, Not How.
Okay.
It's all about, when people have goals and things like that, they ask themselves how rather than who. And it's that's a more entrepreneurial book, but I do have, I will be finished with that book, writing it in about a week. Actually, I have that deadline. And then that book comes out in October. But I do have another book that I want to write. I want to write a book, actually. My next kind of book, like this one, I think it's going to be called Finer Distinctions. And there's a quote that basically says, intelligence is the ability to make finer distinctions. So like, like, for example, my mother-in-law could make a finer distinction about that woman than the other people because she had a better perspective.
Yes.
And so like distinction, your ability to see things clearly or see things differently really matters. And even to see things that you once saw limitedly, to just see things better. But it's also about making decisions, about viewing yourself. And so I think I want to, this book does a lot of good work about how to change perspective, but I think I want to write a really big book about how to see things better and see things more clearly, and about just models, about how to more fine tune how you see things and the decisions you make and the things that you tolerate. Like, as an example, a couple of days ago, I got an email from someone who I heavily respect. Love this woman. She's a very big business owner. Like, she's a big coach, honestly, out in California, and she's huge. And I actually went on her summit recently, and I don't do stuff like that. I don't do any affiliate marketing, any of this stuff. I just don't do that. Like, I don't see my email list as a commodity like I see them as people. And so I never do anything like that. And this person actually was like, hey, when are you going to email about this thing? And I said, you never asked me to, and like, I probably won't. But this was someone I heavily respect. And so it was actually scary to send this text because I was like, I felt pressure, but I just said, I don't like to ever feel obligated. I don't ever like to feel pressured to do something. I want to be respected in my decision-making. And so you never asked me. And I think that this is just, again, me making finer distinctions in my own relationships, like being able to actually, like, in the past, I would have just caved and said yes, but like now I want to be seen, and I want to see things better. And I don't want to tolerate or deal with things that I used to. And I want to help people see things better. Cause it was funny, like, after she actually initially ranted, she was like, how dare you, but then, and I actually just didn't respond. I actually just put my phone on airplane mode and went to bed. But the next day she ended up sending me a text, and she was like, hey, did you listen to my voicemail? Are we okay? Like, is our relationship clear? And I didn't listen to it. But basically what I assume happened, because she sent me like several texts, was she initially had a reaction, which is fine. We have an initial reaction, and then we hopefully reframe it. And I was just like, yeah, we're totally fine. She's like, okay. And I think it took her a day to get around to it, but she's like, it's totally okay if you don't email about this. I will still very much support your book, and I will respect you, and I want to be friends with you. I'm like, I'm fine with any and all of that. I have no disrespect for you. I very much value, but if I do this, I want it to be my decision. I never want to be pressured,
Yes.
There's a really good book actually called Choice Theory. It's an incredible book, just about how people treat strangers with a lot more respect than they often treat their family. Because like with strangers, you're not going to tell someone what to do. You're going to ask them. But often with our family, we tell people what to do, and like, we don't give them choice. It's just interesting. But yeah, anyways, there's a lot to it, but who knows?
I think we could probably talk for a lot more hours.
We could. I would love to hear what you're up to, and I would love to know how I can help.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Listen, guys, we are going to round it out, and thank you so much for watching today. This is the Junk You Should Know show, and Ben's book just dropped a couple days ago. So get on Amazon. Is Amazon the best place to buy it, Ben?
Anywhere they want. Amazon, Audible,
buy it
Barnes,
anywhere you want.
I mean, really just wherever they choose.
Buy it from your favorite vendor, and then what I want you guys to do is circle back with me and tell me what was your biggest takeaway, because this book discussion is going to be ongoing. So circle back once you've had a chance to dive in, and we'll start a little discussion about it. So thank you so much, Ben. Stay on for just a minute, and to the rest of you, we'll see you next week at noon PST on the Junk You Should Know show. I'm Dr. Deniston. This is Dr. Hardy, and we will be signing off. Have a great weekend, everybody.
See you guys.